So today, we're right on the eve in our progression of the path towards civil war, which from our distance of 166 years seems interesting, but as we'll be talking in another couple of meetings, some 600,000 Americans on both sides died in that war. It touched about 10,000 different towns and villages and cities and counties in this country. There wasn't a region that wasn't touched by it, touched by the anguish of it, and also wrestling, even in the midst of civil war, with what it would be like after the war and what would the promise of liberty be after that. So I'm going to take us through the heat of the pre-war several years. And if you could just try to imagine, the thing about history that is interesting to me is that it's about individuals and groups, obviously, but individuals making up their minds one way or another about where they stand. In the case of the mid-19th century, nobody could escape that. There was no middle of the road. You were run over in the middle of the road, and everybody knew that. It was one side or the other. And generally speaking, it was you were either going to abide or even support or loudly support slavery, or you were going to wrestle with what it would be like if there was no slavery. What would that mean? What would the rights be that would be extended to people who had been slaves? So we talked about a fire bell in the night. That was about 30 years after the Declaration, and that was the first real challenge we had because there was some westward movement, and was that area going to be slave or free? And we talked about the Missouri Compromise. And since that time, we've had a Compromise of 1850, and we've had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We went through the Mexican War together. And here we are at a decision that finally pushed, I would say, the country, particularly those who were organizing political opinion in the North against slavery, pushed them to the point where they said enough. And that was a decision by the Supreme Court, interestingly. I'm not making obvious parallels to today. It is what it is. But there was a decision by Roger Taney, who was, at that point, he was the head of the court, and he decided to make the decision himself. And the point was brought because there was a slave by the name of Dred Scott, who had been a servant to an army surgeon back in the 1830s and 1840s. That surgeon died in 1846, but as the assistant, he had traveled to a number of outposts in the West. And because of that, and because he had worked and lived in territories where slavery was forbidden, an attorney took his part and said, he's no longer a slave. He's a free person under our Constitution. That worked with one county court. Ultimately, though, it was overturned, and Dred Scott was remanded to slavery. The appeal, though, brought by persons who thought that was an outrage and injustice, found its way to the Supreme Court. Now, when I tell you this is going to make you uneasy, but another thing about history is that we can't go back and rewrite it. It's 169 years since that decision was made. We've come, in some ways, a long way, in some ways not such a long way, from what people thought was fair and what liberty was under our Constitution. But here's what Chief Justice Roger Taney said. He said that this man, Dred Scott, had no rights. He was not a citizen, and in fact, any black persons of male, female children were not citizens, and therefore actually had no standing before the court. Could have thrown it out, but decided to rule anyway. And he specifically wrote that black persons are, quote, so inferior that they had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. And he went further. He said that Dred Scott never ceased to be a slave, was the property of his owner, quote, no different than a mule or a horse. Finally, the most damaging thing he did overall, I mean, this is damaging enough, but he basically threw out any compromises over the previous 50 years to try to protect the far west and other parts of the north from slavery. He basically said that under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which is part of the Bill of Rights, and which had something else in mind, but that Congress had no right to deprive citizens of their property, including slaves, because he'd already said they were property, anywhere in the United States. So, for tonight anyway, the focus now goes to Illinois. So there's this guy named Abraham Lincoln, who we have encountered a few times as he is becoming more alert to what's happening around the country, learning in his process, his political process. And this was the Taney decision was in 1856. The following summer, Lincoln took his family on a trip out east. It wasn't just to see the sights. At this point, Lincoln, who had been becoming a known quantity on the lecture circuit, both in the East and also in Illinois, was looking quietly to see if he might get some political endorsements from newspapers, particularly the larger Eastern ones that were published also in the Chicagoland area. And in behalf of his run for a seat in the U.S. Senate that was held by Stephen Douglas. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly over this. Lincoln-Douglas debates, what were they about? They were about what the Supreme Court said primarily, and everything leading up to that. There were 7 of them. Interestingly, if you're wondering how there could be such a detail on what they said, and if you want to look, and there are a lot of good sources on this, but you can see literally every word that was said, and how can that be? They didn't have tape recorders and so forth. But what I thought was interesting, they had something that was called Pittman shorthand. Who knows Pittman shorthand? You know, did you ever do that? You did that? Good. Yeah. So you could keep up, but you had to pretty quickly afterward write it down, right? So that's what would happen. And working with reporters that were on the scene, the persons who were taking the shorthand, they could get the text, then they would send it off to sometimes all the way out east, sometimes to Chicago, where this would be put into typeset. And by the next morning, you could have the full account of what Lincoln and Douglas were saying. What the outcome is interesting. The debates crossed a lot of ground. Douglas was a debater of a lot of skill. He had been in the Senate for a long time. Had been a prominent Democrat in the North for a long time. He also wasn't subtle. He resorted to a lot of race baiting to try to get Lincoln into boxes, because it was known that Lincoln wasn't saying I'm an abolitionist, and he wasn't saying I believe in equal political rights. But he did hold the line, and this is far more liberal than what Taney was saying. He said at the time, and this would have been in advance of arguments that were made probably by most people in authority in the North and South together. His argument was that the Declaration of Independence established that all persons had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know that. And then Lincoln said, in the right to eat the bread without leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man. So he refused to be pushed entirely into a box. And he was saying, what you're saying, that people are not human, that they are property, is wrong. And I'm willing to fight for it. And to show that he meant that, after Douglas was elected, at that time, senators in Illinois and around the country were elected by the legislature. The House and the Senate would vote separately. Douglas got 56 votes in Illinois legislature. He got 44. It was close. He did better than he thought. But basically what he said was, after this, that a house divided cannot stand. He said, it can be all one thing or another. It can't be both. And so he's already starting to talk like somebody who might want to be president.